Hi, students. Welcome to video 12. It is on terrestrial biodiversity. So after this video, you should be able to describe the effect of clear cutting on forests, describe methods for mitigating human impact on forests, and explain how human activities affect biodiversity with strategies to combat the problem. So we look at the percentage of forest cover in the United States. You'll notice that in the eastern United States, there's higher percentages, which makes sense if you know that there's more rain on this side. You also see there's lots of rain up here in Washington and Oregon, so that's going to correspond to more forest areas. So these are kind of where our forest resources are. In terms of our largest national parks, which generally correspond with our forest areas, you'll notice that Alaska has a ton of our large national parks. Here in North Carolina, we have one in the western part of the state, the Great Smoky Mountains, and there's a couple scattered around around California and some of those places we saw where most of the rain was. So, throughout human history, our predominant source of energy has been wood. If you remember, wood is also classified as biomass, so they're the same thing here. So before the Industrial Revolution, that's what we used to heat our homes, cook our food, anything that we needed for heat. It's still being used in the developing world as their predominant fuel source, but now we're having a shortage because we are deforesting lots and lots of areas, and we're cutting down all of the trees, and they can't grow back fast enough. So we're taking a renewable resource and making it into a non-renewable resource. So what are some threats to forests? Deforestation is going to be the number one because people are urbanizing, we're growing our cities, we're expanding out, and we're having to cut down the forest as we do that. Another thing we do is agriculture. We plant monocultures. So for example, this up here is a Christmas tree farm in Asheville, North Carolina. And you might be like, oh, it's trees. That's great. The problem is they're just straight rows of trees, and it's not an actual ecosystem. It's just a monoculture. There's one thing being grown, and it's just being grown over and over and over again. So it's not going to support a lot of biodiversity. You also have diseases and insects that can kill a tree, and they can kill many, many trees. So we have the emerald ash burrow is a problem in North Carolina, and you see it kind of burrows into the tree and kills it from the inside out. And here's what a big field of, or a forest of emerald ash burrow sickened trees look like. And it's just from this itty bitty little bug. And then we have climate change impacts. We know we're having more fires because we're having more droughts, higher temperatures. So some things we can do to mitigate deforestation and increase our biodiversity. We can reforest an area, so you can plant trees when you cut them down. You can also make sure that the stuff that you're buying is from a sustainable forestry certification place. If it has this stamp on it, that means that it has been harvested sustainably. You can also find it on wood. Most of the wood that's sold at Home Depot and Lowe's will have this logo on it. So you as a consumer can make sure that you're encouraging sustainability. We can also do things like crop rotation when we're actually planting our trees that will be cut down for wood. We can make sure that we're planting them in different places and not just doing the same thing over and over, taking nutrients out of the soil. We can remove affected trees. So if we notice that a tree is starting to die, we can go ahead and cut it down and use it for its wood. And we can hope that it doesn't infect other trees, whatever is going on with that tree. We can make sure that fires are allowed to burn when they are naturally supposed to. So fire is completely normal. It's needed. It helps to cycle nutrients back into the soil. It helps to start secondary successional species can come in. There are certain types of seeds that have to have fire to germinate. And so this is one thing that's maintaining our habitats. It's keeping all the brush kind of away. It's controlling pathogens. If you don't allow surface fires to actually burn, which is what the Smokey the Bear campaign used to be about, only you can prevent forest fires, except in reality, you're causing worse forest fires. So if you don't allow these small fires to burn, you will end up getting these huge crown fires, which is what we're seeing in California. We're just, huge acres of habitat and homes are being destroyed. So you can do prescribed burns when you notice that there's a lot of buildup, where we actually go in and we plan the area. We have lots of people around to make sure it doesn't get out of control, although not always able to control that. But these small fires can prevent these larger ones from happening. Here's a chart that shows what California's wildfires have looked like. So we know that there's been hotter years, there's been more drought years. We've also increased development, which is one thing leading to some of these wildfires. We're giving the fire more fuel, basically. And what you'll notice from 1970 down to 2017 is this red line has started extending further and further into the year. So here's January, here's December down here. So the red line has gotten longer, meaning that we're having more fires throughout the year, starting earlier in the spring and going later into the fall and winter. We're also having more occurring at one time. So that's what this little bar kind of going up is showing you. So down here, we didn't have as many raised bars, and down here, we're having more and more of them. So that's saying we're having more and more fires throughout those months in that year. It's also very dry. So what this chart shows you, here's the average temperature over time. Here's the average rainfall. And what we have been seeing, the red dot over here, notice that all the years from 2000 onward have been higher temperature than normal. And they've also almost all been lower rainfall than normal in the past 20 years. So that's a trend that we're seeing, and we're probably going to continue seeing that trend. So another threat to biodiversity dealing with forests is palm oil plantations, or just tree plantations in general. This is a picture of one in the Amazon where the orangutan live. So one thing we're doing is we're decreasing biodiversity by planting these palm trees. Palm oil is found in everything from Nutella, things that you eat, all the way to cosmetic products, makeup. So we're cutting down the forest in order to grow these tree farms. We're also using a ton of pesticides because there's lots of bugs in these tropical climates. So we're trying to get rid of them so we can grow our trees. And unfortunately, we're taking land from the indigenous populations that are there. And the orangutan is a very famous example. It is now endangered because we are basically destroying all of its habitat in order to grow these palm trees. So how long does this process take? It takes about 25 to 30 years to grow an actual tree before you can cut it down. And of course, you want to have others growing at different stages so that if you cut some down, you didn't just cut down your entire plot. You want to have another one growing somewhere. So it does take some time to do this, and it takes some planning, and it takes lots of space. So that's one reason why we're utilizing so much of the forested areas. So some ecological services, what do forests actually do for us? Here's the list of them up here. They stabilize soil, which prevents erosion. They slow runoff. They purify our water. They clean our air. Basically, if it can be done, a forest can do it. And you'll notice down here, this is the amount of money that a forested area or whatever the service provides for us. So for example, nutrient cycling is a $350 billion service that's being provided to us. So if we cut down all the trees, we are going to have to fork out that money to provide that service ourselves. So we can harvest trees in a bunch of different ways. We know that clear cutting, we completely get rid of all of the trees, is the worst ecologically that you can do. So here's what clear-cut forest looks like. We can do selective cutting, which is just taking the sick ones or the older ones, or we could do strip cutting, which is basically clear cutting in a row, but it's not quite as bad as clear cutting because you have trees on either side to stabilize hillsides, build up biodiversity, all that sort of stuff. But unfortunately, one thing we're doing is we're causing habitat fragmentation when we do these kinds of things. Basically, what happens is, imagine if you built a highway in the middle of a forest, you're basically dividing that forest in two. And animals are not going to easily go from one side to the other. They might get hit by a car. They're just going to stay away from that highway. They don't really want to interact with people. So the edge of the highway, called edge effect, is going to be very little diversity compared to the actual forest ecosystem. And, if you build another road here, well, now you've cut it into fourths. And we continue building these roads and fragmenting these habitats. So who cares? Why should anybody care about this? Even if you're not like a quote tree hugger, one of the biggest values that forests provide us is medicine. So 2,000 of the 3,000 plants that we use for cancer fighting chemicals and we make drugs with come from the rainforest. So if we don't have this source, we don't have an ability to know whether or not what we're losing could cure something that we're trying to cure. So that's one of the biggest issues that we should make sure that we're stabilizing and keeping our forest healthy. Another thing that decreases biodiversity in terms of forest lands is overgrazing and utilizing an area too much. So if you remember, we talked about this with Terrestrial Commons, how a public resource can become degraded. So overgrazing, basically putting your cattle in an area and letting them just go at it, it reduces the grass cover, which increases erosion. The cattle themselves actually tramp over on the soil and it compacts the soil. So it's kind of like you're increasing erosion and compacting at the same time. Also, if there's plants that the cattle won't eat, they become invasive species and just basically take over everything. And ultimately, it can lead to desertification, which is making an area more desert-like. And this is what it kind of looks like over here, if you can imagine the desertification process. So what can we do to stop this process? We can rotational graze. So basically, you're taking your cattle and you're moving it from one plot to the other, just like crop rotation. You can also do agroforestry, so you can grow crops and graze cattle in one area. So this picture shows you like trees. You're basically kind of farming trees while you also have cattle grazing in the fields. So this is going to increase biodiversity. It's going to decrease your erosion and basically make the ecosystem a lot more stable and good. Okay, bring your questions tomorrow.